Sir Basil's expression darkened further, if such a thing were possible, and he turned toward his nephew with an expression that suggested Timothy had just confessed to embezzling the family fortune. Theatrical? What on earth do you mean by theatrical, Whimsy? The man is dead, murdered most likely. This is hardly the moment for your characteristic obscurities. Whimsy, however, was already moving toward the door, his movements possessed of that peculiar grace that came from a combination of aristocratic breeding and wartime service. On the contrary, my dear Sir Basil, it is precisely at moments of death that obscurities become crystalline. But before we venture toward the deceased's chamber, where I presume the constabulary has not yet trampled all over the evidence with their characteristically bovine disregard for detail, I should like to ask a few preliminary questions. Nothing arduous, I assure you. Merely the sort of trivial matters that help one construct a coherent narrative. He gestured toward the sofa with an air of command that seemed to settle over the room like a chill. Perhaps we might all sit? I find that vertical conversations tend to become circular, whereas seated discourse frequently leads toward the vertical truth. Mrs. Claudia Thorne seated herself with the fluid grace of long practice, arranging her skirts with meticulous care. Timothy remained standing, his fingers working nervously at the cuff of his jacket, a gesture Whimsy noted with interest as his left cuff was distinctly more worn than his right, suggesting a habit of anxious manipulation. Sir Basil remained equally vertical, his stance suggesting that he considered sitting a capitulation to circumstance. "Now then," Whimsy continued, withdrawing a cigarette case from his jacket pocket and offering it first to Mrs. Thorne, who declined with a slight shake of her head, "I find myself curious about the domestic arrangements of this establishment. Mr. Marcus Ashworth, he was, I take it, a resident guest rather than a permanent fixture, and was his room, by any chance, located in what I might characterize as the western wing, given the architectural peculiarities I observed upon arrival?" Sir Basil stiffened. "How could you possibly know that? You've only just arrived this morning." "Deduction, my dear chap, which is merely observation elevated to the status of reasoning. I observed upon entering that the east wing receives significantly more light. Mrs. Thorne's dressing room is positioned there, I should imagine, given the superior quality of the morning illumination that would appeal to a lady concerned with her complexion, whereas the western wing receives the afternoon sun at an angle that would prove most disagreeable for extended habitation, unless one specifically desired privacy and relative isolation. Am I correct?" Timothy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and Whimsy noted with satisfaction that the young man's left foot bore considerably more of his weight than his right, suggesting either injury or a lifetime habit of tension. "You are," Mrs. Thorne replied softly, her voice possessing a quality of resigned acknowledgement. Marcus preferred solitude. He was not, I regret to say, the most convivial of house guests. He had been staying with us for approximately 3 weeks, ostensibly to recuperate from some nervous complaint, though I confess he seemed more agitated as his time with us progressed rather than less so. "Nervous complaint," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "How wonderfully vague, the modern euphemism for a multitude of sins. Tell me, was your brother inclined toward financial embarrassment, romantic entanglement, artistic pretension, or was his nervous complaint of the more pharmaceutical variety?" The question hung suspended, and for a moment the only sound in the drawing-room was the crackling of the fire and the distant percussion of rain against the windows. It was Timothy who finally broke the silence, his voice emerging thin and uncertain. He owed money. Rather a great deal of it, actually. I happened to see some correspondence, not intentionally, you understand, but it was left upon the hall table. Solicitors' letters, that sort of thing. Threats of legal action. Sir Basil made a sound approximating a growl. "Timothy, that is hardly appropriate." "On the contrary," Whimsy interjected smoothly, "it is precisely appropriate. One cannot solve a murder, if murder it is, without understanding the motivations and circumstances of the deceased. Tell me, young Timothy, what was the nature of these debts? Gaming? Women? Or something more exotic, such as blackmail?" Mrs. Thorne's knuckles had whitened as she gripped the arm of the sofa. "My brother had certain associations individuals and organizations of questionable repute. He came to this house seeking refuge, or so he claimed. I suspect he came seeking funds, though my husband was not disposed to provide them. A familial disagreement regarding pecuniary matters, Wimsey observed, turning to Sir Basil. Surely not uncommon, yet frequently the catalyst for actions of considerable violence. Now, before I examine the corpse and its adjacent chamber, I find myself possessed of one final curiosity. When was Mr. Ashworth last observed in apparent good health? What time did he retire to his room, and who, if anyone, visited him subsequent to that retirement? Sir Basil consulted the small pocket watch he had extracted with obvious irritation. He took dinner with us at 7 o'clock this evening, a quiet affair, as he had been somewhat reclusive during his star. Why? He excused himself at approximately 8:15, claiming fatigue. His breakfast tray was delivered to his room at 8 o'clock this morning, and when the housemaid returned an hour later to collect it, she found the door locked, and upon receiving no response to her knocking, she summoned the butler. The door was forced open not 30 minutes past. Wimsey rose to his feet with the smooth motion of one accustomed to action. And the window in his chamber, it was locked from the inside, you say? The key present in the lock? It was, Sir Basil confirmed grimly. The room remains untouched. The constable has been summoned but has not yet arrived. The rain has made the roads nearly impassable. Wimsey smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested he found the prospect of a locked room and a poisoned death not distressing but rather intellectually invigorating. Excellent. Then I suggest we view the scene before constabulary feet have obscured whatever traces remain. Lead on, Sir Basil. Let us examine the death chamber and determine whether we are dealing with murder most cunning or merely suicide most theatrical. The western wing of Blackthorn Manor possessed the particular chill that comes from deliberate disuse, as though the very stones conspired to maintain an atmosphere of isolation and melancholy. The corridor leading to Marcus Ashworth's chamber was lit by electric sconces that cast a sickly pallor over the dark wood panelling, and Wimsey observed with interest that the carpet-runner showed the distinct wear patterns of someone who paced, long rhythmic indentations suggesting hours of anxious ambulation. Sir Basil led the party with the grim determination of a man escorting others to witness a catastrophe for which he felt personally responsible, though whether from guilt or mere social obligation remained uncertain. Behind him came Mrs. Thorne, her expression fixed into the polite mask that well-bred women assume in the presence of tragedy, and Timothy, whose nervous energy manifested itself in the unconscious habit of running his fingers along the wall paneling as they progressed. Wimsey brought up the rear, his movements deliberately unhurried, his eyes taking in details that others passed without conscious registration. The dust upon the picture frames suggesting irregular dusting, the faint discoloration on the carpet where perhaps a chair had stood for some considerable time, and, most notably, a small portrait of a woman that hung at an angle suggesting recent disturbance. The door to Marcus Ashworth's chamber was oak, substantial, and currently standing slightly ajar, revealing a room beyond that, seemed to exude an atmosphere of finality. A uniformed constable stood outside, a young man of perhaps 25, whose expression suggested he found the entire affair profoundly embarrassing and wished to be elsewhere. Lord Peter Wimsey, Sir Basil announced with the tone of one introducing a particularly distinguished expert, will require access to examine the scene. He is here at my invitation and acts with my full authority. The constable, clearly uncertain but equally unwilling to contest the authority that Sir Basil's tone conveyed, stepped aside. Wimsey paused at the threshold, observing without entering, his gaze sweeping across the interior with the systematic precision of a naturalist cataloguing specimens in a museum. The room itself was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 16, with a single window set into the eastern wall, currently closed and secured by its lock. A bed occupied the wall opposite the window, and upon it lay the remains of what had once been Marcus Ashworth, a man whose appearance suggested he had been in his mid-40s at the moment of his departure from the mortal coil. He was dressed in pajamas of what appeared to be finest silk, his body positioned with almost careful arrangement, as though he had deliberately composed himself for observation. Upon the bedside table sat a glass containing perhaps 2 fingers of amber liquid, and beside it an empty bottle that had once contained pills, though whether they were sedative or something more sinister remained to be determined. Whimsy stepped into the chamber with a deliberation that suggested he was traversing hallowed ground, and the others followed in his wake like mourners at a funeral service. The air smelled of something acrid beneath the perfume of death, almonds perhaps, or something chemical that spoke of poisoning. Arsenic does not typically produce that particular aroma, Whimsy observed conversationally, moving toward the window and examining its frame with meticulous attention. The almond scent is more suggestive of cyanide, though the time of death appears inconsistent with such a substance. Tell me, has anyone determined what remained in that glass, or what was contained in the bottle? The police surgeon will make those determinations, Sir Basil said stiffly. I merely reported what I observed, the presence of what appeared to be arsenic. Appeared, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the window frame. An interesting word, suggesting observation rather than certainty. And this window lock, it has been examined? The key is present, I observe, though I confess I find the placement somewhat unusual. Most individuals who secure themselves in for the evening position the key upon the interior sill or bedside table, not, as it appears here, within the lock itself, rotated to the locked position. One might almost imagine it was secured from the exterior, and then the lock manipulated to suggest internal positioning. That is quite impossible, Timothy said. Speaking for the first time since they had entered the chamber. The door was locked from the outside. The only way in was through the window, and that has remained sealed since yesterday morning when the housemaid cleaned the room. Whimsy turned from the window, and his expression bore that peculiar combination of interest and amusement that suggested he had just encountered something that pleased him intellectually. You are remarkably well informed regarding the security arrangements of this chamber, Timothy. Might I inquire how you possess such detailed knowledge? I was under the impression that you had expressed no particular interest in your uncle's household arrangements prior to this tragedy. The young man's face flushed crimson, and he opened his mouth as though to respond, but Mrs. Thorne spoke instead, her voice steady but tinged with something that might have been resignation or desperation. Timothy has been concerned about Marcus. He checked on him yesterday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I believe, to ensure he had everything he required. It is hardly suspicious that he should know the state of the windows. Whimsy smiled gently, a gesture that somehow conveyed both skepticism and acknowledgement. How commendable of young Timothy, an attentiveness to family welfare that speaks volumes regarding his character. And did Mr. Ashworth receive you, Timothy? Or was your concern for his welfare thwarted by a locked door? He didn't answer, Timothy stammered. I assumed he was sleeping. Whimsy nodded slowly, then turned his attention to the bedside table where a small leather journal lay partly concealed beneath a recent edition of the Times. He did not touch it, but merely observed it with the concentrated attention of someone reading a particularly complex philosophical treatise. Sir Basil, I presume this volume has not been examined. And the contents of the waste bin beneath the table, they have been preserved? The constable shifted uncomfortably. We was waiting for the proper authorities, sir. Nothing has been disturbed beyond what was necessary to confirm the death. Exemplary restraint, Whimsy murmured. Then perhaps before we summon the full apparatus of official investigation, I might venture a preliminary observation. This death, while superficially appearing to be a locked-room suicide, contains elements that I find profoundly inconsistent with such a conclusion. The positioning of the body is too deliberate, the arrangement of objects too carefully staged. Someone, I should venture to propose, has taken considerable pains to create an impression of voluntary self-termination, whereas the actual mechanism of death was almost certainly something entirely different. The question that now presents itself is not whether murder has occurred, of that I am now reasonably certain, but rather which of the assembled parties possessed both the motive and the peculiar knowledge necessary to execute such an elaborate deception. The silence that followed Whimsy's pronouncement was of the quality that descends upon a drawing-room when someone has said something profoundly impolite at a formal dinner party. Sir Basil's face underwent a transformation that suggested his circulatory system was engaged in active rebellion against his cerebral authority. Timothy appeared to have undergone a process of calcification, his entire frame rigid with the tension of suppressed emotion. Mrs. Thorne alone maintained her composure, though her fingers had begun a subtle trembling that she attempted to conceal by clasping her hands firmly in her lap. "You go too far, Whimsy," Sir Basil said, his voice emerging as a strangled rasp. "You arrive in my house as a guest, and within the space of an hour, you cast aspersions upon the character A.N.D. intentions of my family. I shall not tolerate such presumption." "On the contrary," Whimsy replied, his tone suggesting he was discussing nothing more contentious than the weather or the proper preparation of kedgeree. "I merely observe what the physical evidence presents. The body, you see, tells its own story to those possessed of sufficient linguistic fluency to read it." Marcus Ashworth did not arrange himself in that position after consuming poison. The toxin, whatever its nature, would have produced muscular rigidity or spasm inconsistent with such deliberate posturing. Therefore, someone else positioned him thus, which necessarily implies that the poisoning occurred before the staging of the scene. Furthermore, the window lock, which Timothy so helpfully informed us has remained sealed, is secured from the interior in a manner suggesting mechanical manipulation rather than manual application from within. When one combines these observations with the curious fact that there exists no note, suicide being traditionally accompanied by some written attestation of intention, one arrives at the inevitable conclusion that we are examining a carefully orchestrated murder. The constable, who had been maintaining a studious neutrality throughout this exposition, now cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but surely these are matters for the inspector when he arrives. I'm not authorized to—" "Of course you're not," Whimsy interrupted with surprising gentleness. "Your role is merely to preserve the scene and ensure that no unauthorized individuals contaminate the evidence, a task in which you appear to have performed admirably. However, I wonder if you might perform one additional service. I should like to examine the lock mechanism more closely, and I find myself possessed of a specific curiosity regarding the corridor outside this cham. Would you be so kind as to check whether the floor in the hallway bears any marks suggestive of recent disturbance? Mud, perhaps, or displaced dust that might indicate prolonged standing, or, alternatively, the passage of feet bearing weight from one location to another." The constable, clearly relieved to be assigned a task that did not involve philosophical discourse regarding murder and motive, departed with alacrity. Whimsy turned his attention back to the assembled family, his expression suggesting he was a schoolmaster contemplating a particularly recalcitrant group of pupils. "Now then, while we wait for the constable to complete his investigation of the corridor, might I impose upon your collective memory regarding the evening's events? I find chronology to be profoundly important in matters of this nature. Sir Basil, you indicated that Mr. Ashworth took dinner with the family at 7 o'clock and subsequently retired at approximately 8:15. I presume this was observed by the household staff. The butler, perhaps, or one of the footmen." "The butler, Graves, attended upon us throughout dinner," Mrs. Thorne supplied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension within her. Marcus appeared to be in reasonable spirits, though he was quieter than usual. He mentioned that he had slept poorly the previous night and intended to retire early. And did anyone observe him between the time he left the dining room and the time his door was secured for the evening? Servants, for instance, attending to their duties in the corridor. Sir Basil shook his head. The household was occupied with clearing dinner and preparing the drawing-room for the evening. The western wing would have been largely deserted. Whimsy moved toward the bedside table with deliberate slowness, his eyes fixed upon the leather journal that lay partially concealed. "I find myself curious about several matters. First, this journal. It appears to have been recently disturbed, as though someone was consulting it within the past few hours. Second, the glass containing the amber liquid. Was it alcohol or something else? And third, most provocatively, the empty bottle of pills. I observe the label has been partially obscured, apparently intentionally. These are not the arrangements one typically observes in cases of genuine suicide, where the individual concerned is usually eager to document their despair and justify their decision. Timothy made a small sound, almost involuntary, and Whimsy's gaze shifted toward him with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You appear distressed, Timothy. Might I inquire why? Surely you bear no responsibility for your uncle's demise. Unless, of course, there are aspects of the evening's events that you have neglected to mention. Something you observed, perhaps, or failed to observe, that troubles your conscience." "I don't know what you mean," Timothy said, but his voice was hollow, unconvincing. Mrs. Thorne placed a restraining hand upon his arm, a gesture that Whimsy noted with considerable interest. "Timothy was with me in the drawing room from 8 o'clock until well past 10, she said firmly. "We were occupied with correspondence and reading. He could not possibly have visited Marcus's chamber. I was not suggesting that Timothy personally administered the poison," Whimsy replied, moving to examine the wardrobe that stood against the far wall. "I was merely observing that he appears to possess knowledge or suspicions regarding the evening's events that extend beyond what the official narrative would suggest. However, we shall return to that matter presently. For now, I find myself possessed of a more immediate curiosity. Sir Basil, you maintained that the window has remained locked since yesterday morning's cleaning. Yet I observe upon the sill here a faint deposit of what appears to be brick dust. Precisely the substance one might expect to find if someone had been tampering with the external fixtures of this window. Might you care to revise your assessment of the temporal security of this chamber? The brick dust observation produced an effect not unlike dropping a stone into still water, the ripples of consequence spreading outward with inexorable logic. Sir Basil's mouth opened and closed with the regularity of a mechanical toy, while Timothy's complexion underwent a transformation toward a shade of green that suggested imminent gastric distress. Mrs. Thorne alone maintained her exterior composure, though her fingers had begun to work with increasing violence at the fabric of her skirt, creating small pleats and then smoothing them away in an endless cycle of nervous preoccupation. "That is impossible," Sir Basil managed, though his voice suggested that even he no longer believed in his own protestations. "The window has been secure. I myself examined it yesterday morning before descending to breakfast." Whimsy smiled, a gesture that conveyed neither warmth nor malice, but rather the detached amusement of one observing the inevitable progression of natural law. "And yet here is the evidence, Sir Basil, suggesting that someone has recently been engaged in modifications to the external frame. Not crude or obvious modifications, mind you. The work of someone possessed of considerable mechanical knowledge and a steadiness of hand. The lock mechanism itself appears undamaged, which speaks to a technical proficiency. One might almost imagine that the window was deliberately secured from the outside to create the impression of an impenetrable chamber, when in fact the seal had been compromised from without through carefully executed tampering." He turned from the window, his movements full, uwade and economical, and directed his attention toward the wardrobe. Opening it with the casual air of one entering one's own dressing room, he surveyed its contents with obvious interest. The garments within were of excellent quality, expensive tailoring that spoke of someone accustomed to considerable personal expenditure. Yet what caught Whimsy's attention was not what hung upon the rail, but rather what lay upon the floor of the wardrobe, a length of rope, carefully coiled, and beside it, a small cloth bundle that appeared to contain tools of some sort. "Now this is increasingly suggestive," Whimsy murmured, withdrawing the rope and examining its construction with meticulous care. Rope of this quality is not typically employed by individuals contemplating self-termination. It speaks rather of someone engaged in activities requiring mechanical competence and ready access to proper equipment. "Tell me, Sir Basil, did your brother-in-law indicate any interest in carpentry or similar pursuits during his residence here?" "He did not," Sir Basil replied, though his voice carried the hollow quality of a man watching the foundations of his certainties crumble before him. The constable returned at this moment, his expression suggesting that he had discovered something of significance that he was uncertain how to articulate. "My lord," he said, directing his remarks toward Whimsy with the automatic deference of a man habituated to recognizing social rank, "there is indeed disturbance in the corridor. Fresh scratches on the stone floor outside this chamber, the sort that might be produced by something metallic being dragged. And there is also this. He extended his hand, offering a small metallic object, a climbing iron, precisely the sort of device employed by burglars and sappers in wartime. Whimsy accepted it with an expression of satisfaction, turning it over in his hands. Why? The appreciation of a connoisseur examining a fine artifact. Excellent observation, Constable. This places certain matters in considerably sharper relief. Now, before we proceed further, I find myself possessed of a specific question regarding the domestic arrangements of this household. Mrs. Thorne, I note that you maintain a steady nerve and considerable composure throughout these revelations. Might I inquire whether your calm derives from innocence or from a prior understanding of the evening's events? Mrs. Thorne's eyes met his, with an expression that suggested she had been expecting precisely this question and had prepared her response with considerable care. I maintain composure because I was raised to do so, my lord. Whatever emotional turmoil may exist beneath the surface is a matter for private contemplation, not public display. However, I will acknowledge that I am not entirely surprised by what you have discovered. My brother Marcus was not, as I suspect you have already discerned, a man possessed of sterling character. He came to this house not seeking refuge but seeking resources, and when those resources were not provided by my husband, he took matters into his own hands. Elaborate, Whimsy commanded, his tone suggesting that pleasantries had now been dispensed with and candor was the only acceptable commodity. Marcus had associates, Mrs. Thorne continued, her voice steady but acquiring the quality of someone delivering testimony in a courtroom. Individuals of questionable background and even more questionable methods. During his residence here, he became increasingly desperate regarding his financial situation. He attempted to borrow money from my husband, substantial sums, which were refused. He then began to speak of obtaining funds through other means. I believe he intended to burgle certain valuables from this house and claim that they had been stolen by common thieves. The rope you discovered and those climbing irons would have been employed in such an enterprise. Timothy, who had been standing in rigid silence, suddenly made a small sobbing sound and turned toward the wall, his shoulders shaking with the effort of suppressed emotion. I did not mean for it to end this way, he said, his voice barely audible. I merely wished to prevent the theft. I thought if I could demonstrate to him that such action would result in his capture and prosecution, he would abandon the scheme. Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle alteration, becoming something more complex than mere intellectual satisfaction, a quality that encompassed both understanding and a profound regret regarding human frailty. And so you visited his chamber yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, not to check upon his welfare, but to confront him regarding the proposed theft. You attempted to dissuade him through appeal to reason or family loyalty. When that proved ineffective, you struck a bargain with him, a bargain that ultimately resulted in his death. Is that an accurate assessment of the situation, Timothy? The young man did not respond, but his continued silence and the trembling of his frame provided eloquence far exceeding any verbal confession. Whimsy moved with deliberate slowness toward Timothy, his movements suggesting not aggression but rather the careful approach of someone handling delicate and potentially volatile machinery. You will forgive me, Timothy, if I do not accept your current silence as satisfactory testimony. The facts, as I understand them, require considerable elaboration before one can arrive at a complete understanding of precisely what transpired in this chamber. However, before we proceed, I find myself in need of clarification regarding a specific matter. The poison, arsenic as Sir Basil initially suggested, or something altogether different, and more pertinently, from whence did it originate? Sir Basil, who had maintained a thunderous silence throughout the recent exchanges, now found his voice with the sudden fury of accumulated resentment. My wife's brother was a scoundrel and a blackguard, and if the boy has poisoned him, then I say he has done a service to this family and society at large. Whatever legal consequences follow, I will ensure that the finest legal counsel is engaged in his defense. How admirable of you, Whimsy said, his tone suggesting he found Sir Basil's protestations simultaneously touching and deeply misguided. And yet I suspect that your enthusiasm for defending young Timothy may diminish somewhat when I reveal the complete truth regarding this evening's events. The poison, you see, did not originate with Timothy at all. It came from a far more proximate and considerably more culpable source. Constable, might you be so kind as to examine the contents of that waste bin beneath the bedside table? I observe there are several fragments of paper that appear to have been deliberately torn and scattered. They may prove illuminating. The constable obeyed with the mechanical precision of one habituated to accepting instruction from those of superior station, withdrawing the bin's contents with careful deliberation. The fragments that emerged were indeed numerous, but one in particular caught Whimsy's attention, a corner of paper bearing the printed legend of a pharmaceutical establishment in London, along with partial handwriting that read, "Arsenic, for preparation of—" The remainder was torn away, but the implication was sufficiently clear. "Now we arrive at matters of genuine interest," Whimsy observed, retrieving the fragment and examining it with the focused intensity of a paleontologist studying ancient inscriptions. This prescription appears to be I. The handwriting of someone accustomed to formal letter writing. The formation of the letters suggests education and possibly some experience with legal or medical documentation. Sir Basil, might I inquire whether you have employed a secretary or clerk during recent months? Someone engaged in legitimate correspondence who might also possess access to pharmaceutical supplies? The question hung in the air like a chess move whose consequences extend several moves into the future. Mrs. Thorne's hand moved instinctively toward Timothy's arm, a gesture of protection that suggested her maternal instincts had overcome any disapproval of his involvement in the current disaster. "My husband employs a secretary," she said quietly, "a man named Cresswell who has been with the household for approximately 8 months. He manages the correspondence relating to Sir Basil's various business concerns." "Cresswell," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, as though committing the name to memory for some future application. "A capable individual, I presume? Someone trustworthy enough to be provided with discretionary access to household affairs and the confidence of the family?" "He comes well recommended," Sir Basil said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier imperious certainty. "He is efficient and maintains an appropriate demeanor. I have had no cause for complaint regarding his conduct or reliability." Whimsy smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested he had reached a moment of profound clarity regarding the nature of human duplicity and the infinite creativity with which individuals craft their deceptions. "Of course you have not had cause for complaint, because Mr. Cresswell has taken considerable pains to ensure that his various enterprises remain hidden beneath the veneer of respectable service. Let me articulate, if I may, a theory regarding the sequence of events that culminated in Mr. Marcus Ashworth's demise. Cresswell has, for some months, been engaged in a systematic campaign of theft and fraud directed against Sir Basil's household. He is intelligent enough to recognize that such enterprises cannot continue indefinitely without discovery, and therefore he has sought to establish an alternative source of income, specifically through blackmail. Marcus Ashworth, arriving at this house as a desperate man in need of funds, presented an ideal opportunity for collaboration. Cresswell offered to assist Marcus in the burglary scheme, but with a hidden agenda. Once Marcus had obtained the stolen goods and disposed of them through Cresswell's criminal connections, Cresswell would then blackmail both Marcus and the family regarding the theft, extracting payment and maintaining silence regarding the entire enterprise. Timothy had ceased his trembling and was now staring at Whimsy with an expression of dawning comprehension. But something went wrong with the plan, the young man said slowly, his voice emerging with the hesitant quality of someone attempting to articulate a complex mathematical proof. "When I confronted Marcus yesterday afternoon, I told him of my suspicions regarding Cresswell's true nature. I revealed that I had observed certain irregularities in the household accounts, discrepancies that suggested systematic theft. Marcus realized that Cresswell had used him, that he was merely a pawn in a larger scheme designed to compromise the family and extract funds through blackmail." "Precisely so," Whimsy affirmed, moving toward the door with the evident intention of departing the chamber. "And therefore, When Cresswell visited Marcus that evening, under the pretense of finalizing arrangements for the burglary, Marcus refused to cooperate further. He threatened to expose the entire scheme to Sir Basil and the constable. Ullery. Cresswell, recognizing that his carefully constructed enterprise was now in jeopardy of complete collapse, administered the poison in the guise of a digestive aid or sleeping draught. He then positioned Marcus's body to suggest suicide, secured the window from the exterior using the climbing irons and rope to create the impression of an impenetrable chamber, and departed with the reasonable expectation that the death would be attributed to self-termination born of despair. What Cresswell did not anticipate was that Lord Peter Wimsey would accept an invitation to Blackthorn Manor, and that such acceptance would result in the complete unraveling of his scheme within the space of a single afternoon. The departure from Marcus Ashworth's chamber proceeded with the ceremonial gravity of mourners leaving a funeral service, though the emotional tenor had shifted considerably from the initial shock and bewilderment that had characterized their earlier ascent to the western wing. Sir Basil led the procession with the grim determination of a man processing the dissolution of his carefully constructed illusions regarding the nature of loyalty and trustworthiness within his own household. Behind him came Mrs. Thorne, her arm linked protectively through Timothy's, her expression suggesting that maternal forgiveness had, if not entirely conquered paternal disappointment, at least achieved a temporary armistice with it. Wimsey followed at a measured pace, his posture suggesting casual indifference to the drama unfolding around him, though his eyes continued their meticulous cataloguing of every detail presented by the corridors through which they progressed. The constable, having been assigned the task of preserving the chamber against further contamination pending the arrival of the police inspector, had been instructed to permit no one to enter without Wimsey's explicit authorization. As the party descended the main staircase toward the ground floor, Wimsey permitted his attention to drift toward the domestic arrangements of the house itself, the placement of paintings, the condition of the furnishings, the subtle indicators of wealth and status that accumulated through generations of accumulated capital and inherited position. It was precisely such observations that led him to inquire, as they reached the entrance hall, whether Mr. Cresswell maintained private quarters within the household or whether he lodged in the village proper. "He has a small suite of rooms in the eastern wing," Sir Basil replied, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man contemplating the complete revision of his understanding regarding the nature of his employees and their reliability. "Adjacent to the library, which facilitates his work with the household correspondence and accounts. He has expressed satisfaction with the arrangement and has shown no inclination toward seeking alternative lodgings." Wimsey's eyebrows ascended slightly, suggesting that this intelligence had produced a modest degree of intellectual gratification. How convenient for Mr. Cresswell, and how profoundly inconvenient for Sir Basil. An individual lodged within the household has access not merely to correspondence and accounts, but to the rhythms and patterns of domestic life itself. He would observe when family members were occupied, when servants were engaged in particular tasks, when the household was most vulnerable to unauthorized intrusion or manipulation. "Tell me, has Mr. Cresswell been absent from his duties at any point during the past 2 days, perhaps claiming illness or requesting a specific evening away from the house?" Sir Basil consulted with Graves, the butler, who had materialized from the nether regions of the household with the efficiency of a man accustomed to pairing exactly when required. Graves confirmed, with the measured precision that characterized his speech, that Mr. Cresswell had indeed taken his evening meal in his own quarters yesterday, and had not been observed in the public rooms of the house after 6 o'clock. Furthermore, upon inquiry this morning, Graves had discovered that Mr. Cresswell's bed had not been slept in, and a preliminary examination of his suite revealed that his wardrobe and personal effects had been substantially depleted. "He has fled," Mrs. Thorne said, her tone suggesting neither surprise nor particularly profound disappointment. He recognized that circumstances had altered beyond his capacity to manipulate them, and he has chosen discretion as the superior alternative to remaining and facing the consequences of his actions. Wimsey exchanged a glance with the constable, a gesture that conveyed a multitude of implications regarding the probable direction of future investigation. Fled, yes, but not, I suspect, with the intention of achieving permanent escape. Mr. Cresswell, I would venture, possesses sufficient intelligence to recognize that the railway stations and major thoroughfares leading from this district will soon be subject to intensive scrutiny by the constabulary. He would also recognize that his description, once circulated, would render him increasingly vulnerable to apprehension through conventional means. Therefore, I suspect he has taken refuge in some location proximate to Blackthorn Manor, perhaps the village, or conceivably in some isolated cottage or farm building known to him through his prior knowledge of the district. You suggest that he remains in the vicinity, Sir Basil said, his expression suggesting that this prospect was simultaneously appalling and oddly reassuring, as though proximity to the villain somehow rendered him more manageable than the abstract knot. Ion of a criminal at large in the wider world. I do not merely suggest it. I propose it as a probability approaching near certainty, Whimsy replied, moving toward the study with the air of one accustomed to making use of other people's furniture and facilities without excessive consultation. And I further propose that we might accelerate his apprehension through the employment of certain stratagems designed to force his hand. Constable, I shall require your assistance in several matters. First, might you dispatch a telegraph to the London Metropolitan Police indicating that a Mr. James Cresswell, believed to be wanted in connection with the death of Marcus Ashworth at Blackthorn Manor, may be attempting to flee the district. Second, might you arrange for a telephone call to the railway station at the nearest town, informing them that they should examine tickets purchased within the past several hours and detain any individual matching Cresswell's description. Third, and most pertinently, you might inform the local constabulary that we shall be conducting a search of the district this evening, beginning with those locations most likely to provide shelter to a fugitive of limited means and considerable desperation. Timothy, who had regained some measure of emotional composure, now ventured a tentative observation. If Mr. Cresswell has indeed committed murder, would he not be more inclined toward attempting to flee the district entirely rather than remaining in the vicinity? Surely his intelligence would direct him toward distant locations where his description is unknown and his past activities are obscured by distance. Whimsy smiled, and there was something paternal and educational in that expression, as though he were pleased to address a question that demonstrated genuine intellectual engagement with the problem at hand. Under ordinary circumstances you would be correct. However, Mr. Cresswell has committed murder in a state of considerable emotional agitation. His carefully constructed enterprise has collapsed, his victim has refused to cooperate with his blackmail scheme, and he has acted with impulsive rather than calculated precision. Such circumstances frequently result in individuals behaving contrary to rational self-interest. Moreover, I suspect that Mr. Cresswell has taken with him certain valuables from his residence, items that he intends to convert to currency through the employment of a fence or similarly criminal associate. The nearest such individuals of that caliber would be located in the village or in the larger town perhaps 10 miles distant. Therefore, I propose that we begin our search in the village itself, specifically targeting those establishments that might provide shelter to a fugitive willing to pay for discretion and silence. The village of Blackthorn, from which the manor derived its nomenclature, though whether the village had preceded the house or vice versa remained a matter of historical ambiguity, presented itself as a modest collection of cottages, shops, and public houses arranged along a single high street with the deliberate randomness of accumulated centuries. The rain, which had maintained its persistent assault throughout the afternoon, had diminished to a dispiriting drizzle that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere, rendering all illusion that 3 tickets had been issued that morning, one to London, one to Manchester, and one to Plymouth. None, however, had been purchased by an individual matching Cresswell's description, a detail that Whimsy received with an expression suggesting that his theoretical prediction had been substantially validated. The public houses presented themselves as logical next locations for inquiry, and Whimsy directed the constable toward the Red Lion, a hostelry of considerable age and dubious reputation that appeared to function simultaneously as a public house, a repository for agricultural implements, and a venue for the conducting of business transactions that existed in somewhat ambiguous relationship to the requirements of local law. The proprietor, a man named Hargrove, whose complexion suggested a long-standing and intimate relationship with his establishment's primary product, regarded Whimsy's inquiry regarding the presence of unfamiliar guests with the studied indifference of someone accustomed to inquiries he had no intention of answering with complete candor. However, the constable's uniform and the clear implication that official investigation was in progress produced a marked alteration in Hargrove's demeanor. He acknowledged, with visible reluctance, that a gentleman answering to the name of Mr. Crawford had indeed taken a room at the establishment approximately 3 hours prior, claiming that he required lodging for the evening pending the resolution of certain business matters in the district. The gentleman, Hargrove noted with the precision of someone whose livelihood depended upon detailed observation of his clientele, had paid in advance with currency rather than requesting credit, and had specifically requested privacy, indicating that he wished to be disturbed neither by the proprietor nor by the other guests. "Mr. Crawford," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully, his tone suggesting that he found the assumed name simultaneously transparent and indicative of a certain residual aesthetic sense on the part of the fugitive. "An interesting selection of nomenclature. I presume this individual is currently in his chamber, and that chamber is, by your description, located on the first floor of this establishment?" Hargrove confirmed both points with visible discomfort, clearly beginning to comprehend that he had inadvertently become complicit in harboring an individual sought by the authorities. Whimsy ascended the stairs with the casual assurance of one entering territory that he had every right to enter, the constable following with substantially greater caution and evident apprehension regarding what might transpire upon confrontation with a potentially desperate and dangerous individual. The corridor on the first floor was dimly illuminated by a single gas sconce, and the doors to the various chambers were arranged in a configuration suggesting that sound, privacy, and discretion were commodities of limited availability at the Red Lion. Whimsy paused before a door marked with the numeral 7, listening with an attention so focused that it suggested he was engaged in deciphering a particularly complex musical composition. From within came the sound of movement, furniture being displaced, drawers being opened and closed, and the faint murmur of what might have been quiet conversation, or perhaps merely the muttering of someone engaged in the sorting of possessions. Without bothering to knock, Whimsy turned the door handle and pushed the door inward with a movement that conveyed neither hesitation nor violence, but rather the casual certainty of someone entering a room in which they possessed both legal and moral authority. The chamber within revealed itself as modest but adequately appointed, and upon the bed lay an array of objects that spoke eloquently regarding Cresswell's intentions and recent acquisition of portable valuables. There were silver pieces, candlesticks, a serving salver, what appeared to be a small mirror with an ornamental frame, and beside these lay a leather satchel apparently filled with currency and negotiable documents. Standing beside the window, partially obscured by the heavy velvet curtains, stood a man of approximately 40 years, possessed of regular features that might have been rendered conventionally handsome, were it not for the expression of profound malevolence that currently animated them. His right hand was partially concealed within his jacket, and the bulge beneath the fabric suggested the presence of some object whose nature Whimsy could readily deduce. "Mr. James Cresswell," Whimsy said, his tone suggesting he was addressing an acquaintance at a social gathering rather than a man suspected of murder and standing in apparent possession of a firearm. "How gratifying to discover that your intelligence regarding optimal hiding places proves substantially inferior to your demonstrated competence in the perpetration of fraud and theft. I had estimated the probability of your remaining at the Red Lion at approximately 37%. As opposed to the 73% probability that you had progressed to one of the larger towns for purposes of disposing of stolen goods and arranging passage to London. You have, I must confess, surprised me, a sensation that occurs with sufficient infrequency as to merit acknowledgement." Cresswell's hand emerged from his jacket, revealing a revolver of sufficient caliber to render threats and posturing unnecessary. "You are remarkably composed for a man facing the probability of imminent violence," he said, his voice emerging with the cultivated precision of someone educated at sea, on considerable expense, and subsequently corrupted through exposure to the seedier aspects of society. "I presume you are the celebrated Lord Peter Wimsey, whose reputation preceded you to Blackthorn Manor. How unfortunate for you that your reputation does not extend to rendering you invulnerable to firearms." Wimsey's expression underwent no alteration, though his eyes flickered briefly toward the constable, a glance that conveyed implications regarding strategic positioning and the precise timing of intervention. "On the contrary," he replied with perfect equanimity, "my reputation extends precisely to surviving the application of firearms by individuals of considerably greater desperation and substantially superior practical experience than yourself. Might I suggest that you place the revolver upon the bed and permit the constable to take you into custody? Your case is not without certain mitigating elements: murder committed in emotional agitation rather than premeditation, a victim of dubious moral character, and circumstances suggesting that you have acted under considerable psychological stress. A competent solicitor might well achieve a reduction in charges, or at minimum an appeal to judicial mercy regarding sentencing." Cresswell's laugh emerged as something between a bark and a sob, a sound devoid of genuine humor and laden instead with the desperate hilarity of someone who has recognized the complete and irrevocable collapse of all his carefully constructed plans and illusions. "Mercy," he repeated, as though testing the word in his mouth to determine whether it possessed any substantive meaning. "You speak of mercy as though it were a commodity available to men of my situation. I am not merely a murderer, Lord Peter. I am a thief, a blackmailer, a fraud, a man who has spent the better part of a decade constructing an existence entirely predicated upon deceptio, and the exploitation of others' weaknesses. Your suggestion regarding judicial mercy is touching in its naive optimism, but we both recognize that no court in this nation would view such accumulated transgression with anything approximating clemency." The revolver remained elevated, its barrel pointed with apparent casualness in the direction of Wimsey's torso, though the trembling of Cresswell's hand suggested that his emotional state, while superficially controlled through force of intellect, remained fundamentally unstable. The constable, positioned in the doorway with an expression suggesting profound uncertainty regarding the appropriate protocol for situations involving armed suspects and aristocratic detectives, appeared to be awaiting some signal regarding intervention. Wimsey, however, maintained his posture of relaxed attention, his eyes fixed upon Cresswell's face with an intensity that suggested he was reading something written in the man's features with the clarity of legible script. "You are correct regarding my naive optimism," Wimsey acknowledged, his tone suggesting neither condemnation nor agreement but merely factual observation. "However, you are incorrect regarding the character of your transgression. You have committed murder, certainly, but murder of a particular variety. Murder born of panic rather than malice aforethought, murder precipitated by the dissolution of circumstances rather than by premeditated intention. The distinction is not merely semantic, it possesses considerable legal significance. A competent barrister might well argue that you administered the poison in a moment of emotional extremity when your carefully constructed criminal enterprise faced imminent exposure. Such argument would not eliminate culpability, but it would provide ground upon which mercy, however modest, might rest." Cresswell's expression underwent a subtle alteration, a flickering of something that might have been hope, or perhaps merely the recognition that continued existence in some form remained theoretically possible. However, the revolver remained steady, and his eyes, while meeting Wimsey's, maintained an expression of fundamental hopelessness. Even if such mercy were possible, which I doubt, the nature of my prior transgressions would preclude it. I did not merely arrive at Blackthorn Manor as a competent secretary seeking employment. I came deliberately as an agent of a criminal organization based in London. My purpose was to establish myself within Sir Basil's household to facilitate systematic theft of valuables and commercial documents that could be employed for extortion and fraud. Marcus Ashworth's arrival was fortuitous. He presented an opportunity to expand my operations, to create additional layers of misdirection and blackmail that would implicate him while protecting my own enterprise. When he proved recalcitrant and threatened exposure, I viewed his death as merely the removal of an obstacle to my continued operations. The poison was administered not in panic, but in calculated elimination of a threat. The admission hung in the air like smoke, and Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle transformation, becoming something more complex than mere intellectual satisfaction. There was in his face a quality of genuine disappointment, as though Cresswell had failed some test that Whimsy had hoped he might pass. "You lie," Whimsy said with quiet certainty. "Not entirely, perhaps, but substantially. The narrative you have constructed is precisely the sort of self-aggrandizing fiction that men of your character employ to convince themselves and others that their crimes are products of design rather than desperation. However, the physical evidence contradicts your account at multiple crucial junctures. The poison was administered hastily, its application suggesting urgency rather than calculated deliberation. The window was sealed from the exterior in a manner suggesting improvisation rather than premeditation. The body was positioned with evident care, but care driven by panic rather than methodical planning. These are not the characteristics of someone engaged in a systematic criminal enterprise. These are the characteristics of someone who has acted in emotional agitation and subsequently attempted to conceal the consequences through theatrical staging. Cresswell's hand trembled more visibly, and his jaw clenched with visible tension. "Your perspective is irrelevant, Lord Peter. Whatever the philosophical nature of my crime or its precipitating circumstances, the legal consequences remain identical. I shall face trial, conviction, and ultimately execution. There is no scenario in which my future extends beyond a prison cell and ultimately the gallows. Given such circumstances, I find myself disinclined toward surrendering to the constabulary and accepting the prolonged indignity of legal process. I choose instead a more expeditious resolution." He raised the revolver with sudden decisiveness, bringing it toward his own temple in a gesture that transcended mere theatrical posturing. In that instant, the dynamic of the situation underwent fundamental transformation. The constable lunged forward with the desperation of someone suddenly recognizing that his failure to act would result in consequences extending far beyond mere dereliction of duty. Whimsy, however, moved with a fluidity that suggested his apparent passivity had concealed a readiness born of considerable military experience. He pivoted with economical precision, his right leg extending in a movement that possessed the practiced efficiency of someone trained in the application of violence through unconventional. His foot connected with Cresswell's wrist with sufficient force to disrupt the man's aim, and the revolver discharged with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the confined space of the chamber. The bullet passed through the window with a sound of shattering glass, and Cresswell staggered backward, his grip upon the weapon loosening. The constable, accelerated by the proximity of the gunshot, seized the opportunity to move forward and wrestle the revolver from Cresswell's possession. The struggle was brief, violent, and ultimately conclusive. Within moments, Cresswell found himself pinned against the wall with the constable applying restraints that rendered further resistance futile. Whimsy stood apart, his posture suggesting neither triumph nor particular satisfaction, merely the quiet awareness of a task having been completed according to specifications. "Well," he observed, adjusting his jacket with the precision of someone tidying minor sartorial disarrangement, "that represents a more definitive resolution than I had anticipated. Constable, I presume you have handcuffs available? Mr. Cresswell will require restraint during the journey to the local constabulary. I suspect that the inspector, when he arrives, will possess questions regarding both this evening's events and the broader nature of Mr. Cresswell's criminal activities. Such questioning would be substantially facilitated by the suspect remaining conscious and relatively uninjured, observations that I mention primarily to discourage excessive enthusiasm regarding the application of custody procedures. The return journey to Blackthorn Manor, proceeded through darkness, rendered marginally less absolute by the constable's electric torch and the faint illumination of village lampposts shrouded in mist. Cresswell, now secured with restraints that rendered escape impossible and resistance merely uncomfortable, maintained a posture of rigid silence that suggested he had withdrawn into some internal geography of regret and recrimination from which external circumstance held no power to extract him. The constable maintained a position immediately behind the prisoner, his demeanor suggesting that he had evolved from the initial uncertainty regarding proper protocol into a man possessed of clear conviction regarding his responsibilities and their proper execution. Sir Basil and Timothy, who had waited at the Red Lion with the anxiety of spectators at a theatrical performance whose outcome remained uncertain, emerged from the public house with expressions suggesting profound relief at the restoration of order and the tangible presence of the perpetrator now secured in custody. The motor car that had conveyed Whimsy to Blackthorn Manor that morning had been retained for precisely such contingencies, and within the space of 30 minutes, the party had progressed through the rain-slicked lanes toward the manor house, arriving at its entrance with the ceremonial gravity of a Victorian funeral procession. Mrs. Thorne was waiting in the entrance hall, her expression suggesting a combination of relief and something more complex, a recognition perhaps that while the immediate crisis had been resolved, the aftermath would bring its own complications and discomforts that no amount of social grace could entirely mitigate. The drawing room, to which the assembled party made their way, possessed a quality distinctly different from its appearance earlier that day. The fire had been restored to vigorous combustion, and additional lamps had been lit, creating an atmosphere that suggested warmth and security, rather than the damp chill that had permeated the space during the afternoon's investigations. Graves materialized with the inevitability of fate itself, bearing with him a tea, ray containing whiskey, brandy, and water, beverages that he distributed with the practiced precision of someone who understood that emotional crisis frequently necessitated chemical intervention. Sir Basil accepted a tumbler of whiskey with the gratitude of a drowning man offered rescue, while Timothy, after a glance toward his mother, accepted a smaller quantity diluted with water. Mrs. Thorne herself accepted nothing, maintaining her posture of composed observation that suggested she was a woman accustomed to monitoring the emotional states and behavioral patterns of those around her, with the vigilance of a chess player contemplating multiple moves in advance. Whimsy, declining the offer of spirituous refreshment with a gesture that conveyed neither temperance nor abstinence but merely a preference for continued mental clarity, settled himself into an armchair with the air of someone prepared to provide the sort of comprehensive exposition that the assembled party clearly anticipated and required. Before I elaborate upon the complete sequence of events that culminated in Mr. Marcus Ashworth's death and Mr. James Cresswell's apprehension, Whimsy began, his tone suggesting he was addressing an audience gathered for a lecture on a matter of particular intellectual significance. I find it necessary to clarify certain aspects of the case that may remain obscure or subject to misinterpretation. The initial appearance of suicide, the locked window, the positioned body, the apparent digestive draught containing arsenic, represented an elaborate theatrical construction designed to achieve precisely what it achieved, the immediate conclusion on the part of local constabulary that a desperate man had terminated his own existence through self-administered poison. Such a conclusion would have permitted Cresswell's criminal enterprise to continue uninterrupted, as the death would have been attributed to Marcus Ashworth's documented history of financial embarrassment and emotional instability. However, certain details suggested to anyone possessed of sufficient observational capacity that matters were substantially more complex than they appeared on their surface. Sir Basil interrupted with a gesture that conveyed both interest and a residual uncertainty regarding the legitimacy of Whimsy's interpretation. "You refer to the button," he said, his tone suggesting that he was testing his own comprehension of the deductive process. "The button on the carpet that you discovered and examined. What significance possessed that object?" Whimsy smiled, and there was in that expression a quality of satisfaction suggesting that Sir Basil had recognized a detail of genuine importance. The button was, in fact, of peripheral significance. Its value derived primarily from what it represented regarding the nature of the investigative process itself. It suggested the presence of a struggle, or at minimum, the violent displacement of clothing at some point during or subsequent to the commission of the crime. More importantly, Its discovery led me to examine the wardrobe and thereby locate the climbing equipment and rope that Cresswell had employed in securing the window. However, the true revelation regarding the nature of the crime emerged from observations considerably more subtle. The brick dust upon the windowsill, the scratches upon the corridor floor, the incomplete attempt to obscure the pharmaceutical prescription, these elements, combined with the temporal inconsistencies that Timothy's testimony ultimately revealed, constructed a coherent narrative that only the application of logic and imagination could fully articulate. Timothy leaned forward, his earlier nervousness having given way to something approximating intellectual engagement. When I confro, Ted Marcus. Yesterday afternoon I informed him of my suspicions regarding Cresswell's true nature. Marcus was devastated. He had convinced himself that he was engaged in a genuine conspiracy with a man of criminal expertise, when in reality he was merely being manipulated toward his own destruction. He confessed to me the entire arrangement, explaining that Cresswell had approached him weeks prior with an offer of assistance in obtaining funds through theft and subsequent sale of the stolen goods. Marcus believed that he was engaging in a partnership of equals, not recognizing that Cresswell intended to use him as a tool for blackmail and then discard him once his usefulness had been exhausted. Mrs. Thorne's hand moved to her son's shoulder, a gesture suggesting both comfort and acknowledgement of his courage in revealing information that implicated both his own prior knowledge and his family's vulnerability. I attempted to convince Marcus to abandon the scheme entirely and permit me to inform Sir Basil of the entire matter, Timothy continued, his voice acquiring greater steadiness as he progressed. Marcus refused. He was terrified of prosecution, of imprisonment, of the complete dissolution of whatever remained of his life and reputation. We argued, and ultimately I departed with the intention of permitting him time to contemplate the consequences of his prospective actions. I never imagined that Cresswell would act so precipitously or so violently. Wimsey nodded slowly, his expression suggesting neither blame nor approval, but merely the acknowledgement of testimony provided by one possessed of relevant information. Cresswell, upon learning from Marcus that his scheme had been compromised and that exposure was imminent, recognized that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise faced complete collapse. He administered the poison during what he represented to Ma. RCUs as a final consultation regarding the burglary arrangement. The arsenic was indeed present in what Marcus believed to be a digestive aid, a preparation specifically chosen for its delayed onset, which would provide Cresswell with adequate time to secure the window from the exterior and establish the appearance of a locked chamber. However, Cresswell had underestimated the investigative acuity that would be brought to bear upon the case, and he had failed to account for the possibility that an individual of Lord Peter Wimsey's demonstrated capabilities might accept an invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The final section of the narrative proceeded with the inexorable logic of a chess problem reaching its inevitable conclusion, though the human elements involved rendered the resolution infinitely more complex and morally ambiguous than any mere puzzle of pieces and squares could convey. The police inspector arrived at Blackthorn Manor approximately 2 hours subsequent to Cresswell's apprehension, a man of some 50 years possessed of the methodical competence that characterized provincial law enforcement and the awareness that he was in the presence of expertise substantially exceeding his own. He examined the evidence that Wimsey had meticulously preserved, the button, the climbing irons, the fragments of pharmaceutical prescription, and conducted interviews with the assembled household, staff, and family members that proceeded with the inevitable repetition and elaboration that characterized official investigation. By the time the inspector had concluded his preliminary examination of the scene and the suspect, the evening had progressed toward the hour of midnight, and the manor house had acquired the quality of a place simultaneously relieved and traumatized by the events that had transpired within its confines. Cresswell, when confronted with the physical evidence, and the testimony of both Timothy and Wimsey regarding the sequence of events, abandoned his earlier theatrical posturing and confessed with a flatness of affect that suggested emotional exhaustion had displaced all capacity for continued resistance or self-aggrandizement. He provided detailed accounts of his criminal background, his recruitment into organized criminal enterprise, his infiltration of Sir Basil's household, and ultimately his panic-driven decision to eliminate Marcus Ashworth when circumstance and Timothy's intervention had rendered his position untenable. The confession, recorded with meticulous accuracy by a police constable of remarkable patience and legible handwriting, provided the prosecutor with precisely the sort of comprehensive admission that rendered trial a mere formality rather than a genuine contest between competing interpretations of fact. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when Whimsy found himself once more in the drawing room, this time alone save for Sir Basil, who had dismissed his household staff, and dismissed as well the constable detailed to maintain vigil over the premises pending the execution of warrants and the removal of evidence to proper custody. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room had acquired that particular quality of melancholy that descends upon spaces where significant trauma has occurred and been subsequently acknowledged. Sir Basil positioned himself in an armchair across from Whimsy, his expression suggesting a man contemplating questions that possessed no entirely satisfactory answers. "I am profoundly grateful for your intervention in this matter," Sir Basil began, his voice emerging with the formality that characterized men unaccustomed to expressing genuine emotion. "However, I find myself possessed of certain lingering curiosities regarding aspects of the investigation that were perhaps fully elaborated during your exposition. Specifically, I wonder whether you suspected from the outset that Cresswell was the guilty party, or whether your suspicion developed progressively through the accumulation of evidence." Whimsy smiled slightly, and there was in that expression something both weary and profoundly philosophical. "I suspected nothing of the sort at the outset, Sir Basil. I arrived at Blackthorn Manor possessed of no preconceptions regarding the death, no theories regarding the identity of the perpetrator, and no assumptions beyond the fundamental recognition that murder, when it occurs, typically derives from comprehensible human motives rather than from mystical or inexplicable causes. The button suggested to me merely that the crime scene had not been as carefully prepared as the perpetrator believed. The window dust suggested to me that mechanical tampering had occurred. The rope and climbing equipment in the wardrobe suggested to me the profession of the individual who had employed them. It was only through the systematic accumulation and logical arrangement of these observations that the identity of the guilty party emerged from obscurity into relative clarity." Sir Basil considered this response with the seriousness of a man attempting to extract philosophical significance from a matter that was ultimately reducible to procedural mechanics. "And Timothy's role in the matter? I confess I remain uncertain regarding the extent to which my nephew bears responsibility for the events that have transpired. He withheld information regarding his confrontation with Marcus, information that might have permitted us to intervene before the tragedy occurred." Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle alteration, becoming something more complex than intellectual satisfaction. Timothy's role was that of a young man possessed of good intentions and in Suffolk. Experience in the management of complex ethical circumstances. He discovered information suggesting criminal conspiracy. He attempted to persuade his uncle to abandon the proposed scheme, and when confronted with resistance and escalating desperation on Marcus's part, he departed with the intention of permitting time and reflection to operate their gradual influence upon his uncle's judgment. This was not negligence, it was merely the imperfect decision-making that characterizes youth when faced with situations of moral complexity and emotional intensity. I suspect that Timothy will spend the remainder of his life contemplating whether his silence during those crucial hours contributed materially to the death that subsequently occurred. That contemplation will constitute a punishment far exceeding anything that the legal system might impose. Sir Basil's shoulders seemed to descend slightly, as though he had been carrying a burden that was only now being gradually transferred to appropriate recipients. "And what of my household? What of the trust that I placed in individuals whom I believe to be honest and competent? How am I to reconstruct the certainties that have been so thoroughly demolished by these events?" Whimsy rose from his chair with movement suggesting that the hour had advanced sufficiently that departure would be appropriate and, indeed, necessary. "You reconstruct them, Sir Basil, through the recognition that human judgment is perpetually subject to error, that the appearances we create are frequently insufficient guarantors of underlying character, and that the world contains within it a quantity of malice and deception that no amount of caution can entirely eliminate. However, the the world also contains individuals like your wife and your nephew, individuals possessed of fundamental decency despite their imperfections, individuals capable of courage, and moral growth despite their inevitable failures. Upon such individuals, the reconstruction of trust and certainty must necessarily rest. As for Mr. Cresswell, he will face trial, conviction, and ultimately execution, the consequences that all murderers face when their crimes are discovered and their guilt established. His criminal enterprise will be dismantled, his associates will be apprehended through the information he has provided in exchange for marginal consideration in sentencing, and the world will be marginally safer for the removal of a predatory and calculating individual from its midst. The button on the carpet which initiated this entire cascade of revelations will doubtless be returned to the evidence repository where such objects rest in perpetuity. And I, having concluded my business here, shall depart at first light for London, where other cases undoubtedly await the application of logic, observation, and the modest intellectual capacity with which Providence has seen fit to endow me. With those words, Whimsy extended his hand towards Sir Basil in gesture of farewell, and that gentleman rose to accept it with the gratitude and residual perplexity characteristic of those who have been rescued from crisis by means they scarcely understood.